We cannot be silent. Speaking truth to a culture redefining sex, marriage, and the very meaning of right and wrong. By R. Albert Mohler. Only take care, and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children, and your children's children. Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 9. Preface. One of my most vivid memories of childhood is standing with my grandfather, looking out on the landscape after a hurricane had passed through our town. Growing up in Florida, I knew to respect the great storms, but I was not prepared to see how much the landscape had been changed. I can remember thinking that I had underestimated the storm, a mistake I was determined not to make again. Something similar is happening to many Christians in America today. We look out on the horizon around us and realize that our culture has been radically changed. In this case, the storm is a vast moral revolution, and that revolution is not even close to its conclusion. In fact, there will likely be no conclusion to this moral revolution within our lifetimes, or the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren. We are now witnesses to a revolution that is sweeping away a sexual morality and a definition of marriage that has existed for thousands of years. This is the morality and understanding of marriage that has been central to society shaped by biblical witness and the influence of both Judaism and Christianity. It is also important to note that throughout human history, in virtually all civilizations, marriage has been understood as the union of a man and a woman. That has changed. This book is about this moral revolution, how it happened, and what it means for us, for our churches, and for our children. It is important to trace the revolution and understand that the most heated controversies of our day did not emerge from a vacuum onto the daily headlines. Every revolution has a story, and the story of this revolution is one that we can now trace. To put the truth plainly, this revolution did not start with same-sex marriage, and it will not end there. The revolution that is centered on transforming sexual morality and redefining marriage has succeeded faster than its most eager advocates had even imagined, as they themselves now admit. But this revolution could not have achieved such a velocity if the ground had not been cleared by developments that came long before same-sex marriage. We will look at what came before same-sex marriage, and we will look into the future to what may come after. Every Christian church and every Christian will face huge decisions in the wake of this moral storm. When marriage is redefined, an entire universe of laws, customs, rules, and expectations changes as well. Words such as husband and wife, mother and father, at one time the common vocabulary of every society, are now battlegrounds of moral conflict. Just consider how children's picture books will have to change in the wake of this revolution. As those who demand this revolution make clear, there will be no model of a normative family structure left in its wake. But this revolution has also reached into our churches. Some are arguing that Christians need to revise our sexual morality and the definition of marriage to avoid costly and controversial confrontations with the culture at large. Are they right? In Chapter 1, we trace the revolution and its vast impact. Like a hurricane on a radar screen, this massive moral shift can be seen in its development and its storm track. We cannot tell this story without looking at how secularized our society has become. It turns out that the secularizing of the culture is central to the moral shift. In Chapter 2, we look at the arrival of birth control and divorce, and at the fact that few Christians seemed to understand at the time that these developments were setting the stage for a total redefinition of marriage and the family. You can't have a sexual revolution without easy contraception and so-called no-fault divorce. By the early 1970s, both were largely in place. Christians seemed to take little notice of either. In Chapter 3, the development of the homosexual movement is put within the context of that moral revolution. Those advocating for the normalization of same-sex relationships and behaviors built upon the momentum of the sexual revolution, and they did so with spectacular success. Chapter 4 is a close look at same-sex marriage itself. How is it possible that marriage could be redefined to include a man married to another man, or a woman married to another woman? We know that a majority of Americans now affirm what just a decade ago a vast majority rejected: the legalization of same-sex marriage. What does this mean? What will it mean? Chapter 5 considers the transgender revolution. In the long run, the redefinition of sex and gender will have even more far-reaching consequences than the redefinition of marriage. Are there any limits to where the transgender revolution will lead? None are yet in sight. Chapter 6 looks squarely at the end of marriage. What will marriage mean when virtually anyone has a right to marry? What can it mean? Some voices on both sides of the same-sex marriage controversy agree that, whatever else may happen, marriage will never be the same. Indeed, marriage as a privileged and respected institution, even as an expectation of normal adulthood, is disappearing before our eyes. Chapter 7 asks a straightforward question. What does the Bible really say about sex? For biblical Christians, this is the most important question of all. We will look at the Bible's understanding of sex, gender, marriage, and morality. The Bible will establish the framework for our consideration of marriage, identity, and sexuality. As we will see, the Bible presents a clear understanding of sex, gender, and marriage as among God's greatest gifts to humanity, to be honored as He intended. Chapter 8 looks at the very real and urgent challenges to religious liberty we now confront. These challenges jump right onto the headlines virtually every week, and the list of issues headed for courts and legislatures is long and getting longer. Will Christian colleges and universities be coerced into violating Christian conviction? Will individual Christians be denied their religious liberties? What will same-sex marriage mean for your church and its freedom? Chapter 9 steps back to look at the sexual revolution, right down to the arrival of same-sex marriage, in light of the gospel of Jesus Christ. For Christians, the gospel is our constant frame of reference. In that light, the moral confusion of our day represents a real opportunity for courageous Christian witness. If we have confidence in the gospel, we will have confidence in the compassion of truth. Chapter 10 is a consideration of pressing questions. Should a Christian attend a same-sex wedding? Is sexual orientation a choice? How do we balance truth and compassion? Would you allow your child to play at a home with two moms or two dads? Why do none of the ancient Christian creeds define marriage? Should government legislate morality? These are just a few of the questions now pressing upon us. How should we answer? And finally, the book concludes with a word to the listener, written in response to the Supreme Court's decision on gay marriage. I remember standing with my grandfather and looking at a large boat lying on its side, far from the lake. I didn't have to ask how it got there. The hurricane explained everything. We cannot understand our times without looking honestly at the moral hurricane sweeping across our culture, leaving very little untouched, if not radically changed, in its wake. But understanding is just a start. When it comes to marriage and morality, Christians cannot be silent, not because we are morally superior, but because we know that God has a better plan for humanity than we would ever devise for ourselves. Beyond that, we cannot be silent because we know that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that He came to save us from our sins. We cannot rightly tell people about the gospel of Jesus Christ if we do not speak rightly about sin and its consequences. As I have said, I stood there with my grandfather, determined never to underestimate a hurricane again. We dare not underestimate the scale, scope, and significance of this moral revolution. Even more urgently, we cannot underestimate the gospel of Jesus Christ. This book is written in the hope that the church will be found faithful, even in the midst of the storm. 1. In the wake of a revolution. The prophetic writer Flannery O'Connor rightly warned us years ago that we must push as hard as the age that pushes against you. This book is an attempt to do just that. We are living in the midst of a revolution. The Christian church in the West now faces a set of challenges that exceeds anything it has experienced in the past. The revolution that has transformed most of Western Europe and much of North America is a revolution more subtle and more dangerous than revolutions faced in previous generations. This is a revolution of ideas, one that is transforming the entire moral structure of meaning and life that human beings have recognized for millennia. This new revolution presents a particular challenge to Christianity. For a commitment to the authority of Scripture and to revealed truths runs into direct conflict with the central thrust of this revolution. Christians are not facing an isolated set of issues that cause us to be merely perplexed and, at times, at odds with the larger culture. We are instead facing a redefinition of marriage and transformation of the family. We are facing a complete transformation of the way human beings relate to one another in the most intimate contexts of life. We are facing nothing less than a comprehensive redefinition of life, love, liberty, and the very meaning of right and wrong. This massive revolution is taking place across the entire cultural landscape, affecting virtually every dimension of life, and demanding total acceptance of its claims and affirmations of its aims. Christians who are committed to faithfulness to the Bible as the Word of God and to the gospel as the only message of salvation must face this unavoidable challenge. A comprehensive revolution. British theologian Theo Hobson has argued that the scale and scope of this challenge are unprecedented. According to critics of Hobson's argument, the challenge of the sexual revolution and the normalization of homosexuality is nothing new or unusual. Churches have always shown the ability to plod their way through hard moral issues before, and so they will again with homosexuality. Hobson himself confessed that he would have agreed with this line of reasoning at one point, but not anymore. For Hobson, the issue of homosexuality presents the church with a challenge it has never faced before. Why is this such a challenge to Christianity? Hobson has suggested that the first factor is the either-or quality of the new morality. There is no middle ground in the church's engagement with homosexuality. Either churches will affirm the legitimacy of same-sex relationships and behaviors, or they will not. Hobson's second factor is the new morality's rapid rate of success. The normalization of homosexuality, something regarded as unspeakably immoral for centuries, has happened at breakneck speed. It has happened so fast that homosexuality is now considered as a legitimate lifestyle, and one that deserves legal protection. Moreover, as Hobson argued, the speed of the new morality's success has basically ousted traditionalist sexual morality from the moral high ground. In other words, the sexual revolution has actually turned the tables on Christianity. The Christian church has long been understood by the culture at large to be the guardian of what is right and righteous. But now the situation is fundamentally reversed. The culture generally identifies Christians as on the wrong side of morality. Those who hold to biblical teachings concerning human sexuality are now deposed from the position of high moral ground. This change is not simply the waning of the taboo. As Hobson explained, the case for homosexual equality takes the form of a moral crusade. Those who want to uphold the old attitude are not just dated moralists, as is the case with those who want to uphold the old attitude to premarital sex or illegitimacy. They are accused of moral deficiency. The old taboo surrounding this practice does not disappear, but bounces back at those who seek to uphold it. Such a sharp turnaround is, I think, without parallel in moral history. The moral revolution is now so complete that those who will not join it are understood to be deficient, intolerant, and harmful to society. What was previously understood to be immoral is now celebrated as a moral good. The Church's historic teaching on homosexuality, shared by the vast majority of the culture until very recently, is now seen as a relic of the past and a repressive force that must be eradicated. This explains why the challenge of the moral revolution poses such a threat to the whole of Christianity and to its position in modern societies. And yet, even as we understand this revolution to be a new thing, its roots are not recent. As a matter of fact, the Church has seen the sexual revolution taking place turn by turn for virtually all of the last century. What now becomes clear is that most Christians vastly underestimated the challenge the sexual revolution represents. The source of the sexual revolution: the secularization of the Western worldview. The background to this revolution is a great intellectual shift that occurred in concert with the secularization of Western societies. The modern age has brought many cultural benefits, but it has also brought a radical change in the way citizens of today's societies think, feel, relate, and make moral judgments. The Enlightenment's elevation of reason, at the expense of revelation, was followed by a radical anti-supernaturalism. From looking at Europe, it is clear that the modern age has alienated an entire civilization from its Christian roots, along with Christian moral and intellectual commitments. Scandinavian nations, for example, now register almost imperceptible levels of Christian belief. Increasingly, the same is true of both the Netherlands and Great Britain. Sociologists now speak openly of the death of Christian Britain, and the evidence of Christian decline is abundant throughout most of Europe. That same Christian decline has now come to America. In 1983, Carl F. H. Henry described the future possibilities for Western societies. If modern culture is to escape the oblivion that has engulfed the earlier civilizations of man, the recovery of the will of the self-revealed God in the realm of justice and law is crucially imperative. Return to pagan misconceptions of divinized rulers, or a divinized cosmos, or to quasi-Christian conceptions of natural law or natural justice, will bring inevitable disillusionment. Not all pleas for transcendent authority truly serve God or man. By aggrandizing law and human rights and welfare to their sovereignty, all manner of earthly leaders eagerly preempt the role of the divine and obscure the living God of scriptural revelation. The alternatives are clear. Either we return to the God of the Bible, or we perish in the pit of lawlessness. Regrettably, Henry's warning has gone unheeded, and the path of American culture has become more and more secularized. Secular refers to the absence of any binding divine authority or belief. Secularization is a sociological process, whereby societies become less theistic as they become more modern. As societies move into conditions of deeper and more progressive modernity, they move away from a binding force of religious belief, and theistic belief in particular. Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor has compellingly portrayed the story of Western society's transition into secularism. In his book, A Secular Age, Taylor described the pre-modern age as a time when it was impossible not to believe. In other words, belief in God had no intellectual alternatives in the West. There was no alternative set of explanations for the world and its operations, or for moral order. All that changed with the arrival of modernity. In the modern age, a secular alternative to Christian theism emerged, and it became possible not to believe. But during this time, theism was still intellectually and culturally viable. But as Taylor noted, those days are behind us. In our own postmodern age, it is now considered impossible to believe. Significantly, Taylor pinpoints this unbelief as a lack of cognitive commitment to a self-existent, self-revealing God. Secularization is not about rejecting all religion. In fact, even hyper-secularized Americans often consider themselves to be religious or spiritual. Secularization, according to Taylor, is about the rejection of a belief in a personal God, one who holds and exerts authority. The implications of this worldview shift are massive. For example, in light of these current intellectual conditions, sociologist Mary Eberstadt has noted that it is surely the case in large stretches of the advanced West today. Many sophisticated people do not believe that the churches have any authority whatsoever to dictate constraints on individual freedom. This may be true, but the church cannot abdicate its responsibility for Christian truth-telling in a postmodern age. The secular conditions make it more challenging and difficult, even seemingly impossible at times. Our culture is growing more and more resistant to a God, any God, who would speak to us with words such as "thou shalt" and "thou shalt not." The fact that Christians enter every conversation as believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, who are bound by biblical revelation, means that society will label us as the intellectual outlaws, breaking the rules of engagement by appealing to a personal creator and divine authority. Yet explicit Christian truth-telling is the Church's reason for being. As Peter wrote, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. The God of the Bible has sent his church into the world to tell the truth about himself, about his laws and commands, about his grace and love, and most important, about the gospel of Jesus Christ. The American Sex Revolution. Today we are witnessing nothing less than a total revolution in sexual morality. And a moral revolution is dramatically more important than a mere moral shift. Moral shifts happen all around us and can regularly result in positive cultural transitions. For example, as someone who grew up in the 1960s, I can remember positive comedic depictions of drunken behavior on television. But Otis, the benevolent drunk on The Andy Griffith Show, would be impossible to present in the mainstream media today. This is due to the important shift in moral judgment concerning alcohol and drunk driving. A successful anti-drunk driving campaign has turned what was thought in the 1950s to be a minor indiscretion to what is now understood, quite properly, to be a major crime. The eventual heightened criminalization and moral sanction against drunk driving was the result of a society coming face to face with horrible damages caused by drunk driving. This kind of moral change happens on any number of issues, but in a way that can be absorbed within the general moral trajectory of a culture. In other words, moral change generally takes a rather long period of time, and in a way that is consistent with a culture's moral commitments. A moral revolution represents the exact opposite of that pattern. What we are now experiencing is not the logical outworking of the West's Christian-influenced teachings on human sexuality, but the repudiation of them. This is a fundamentally different type of moral change, and represents a challenge that is leaving many Christians confused and befuddled, some angry and anxious, and others asking hard questions about how the church should respond in such a time of crisis. All this has to be put into the larger context of changes that have transformed the way most people in Western societies think. The moral revolution is part of a seismic shift in Western culture that has occurred during the last 2 centuries. In that span of time, vast social changes have transformed the way people in advanced industrialized economies live, relate to one another, and engage the larger world. If that sounds like an overstatement, just consider the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, Most Americans lived in a rural context as part of an extended family, and with a range of geographic mobility that was generally confined to a very small area. The idea that human beings would be flung coast to coast in an advanced economy, and that work would be transformed from the tilling of the soil to what is now described as knowledge work, is something that would have been inconceivable. These cultural transformations have uniquely impacted the family, which has been stripped of many of its defenses and separated from the larger context of kinship and the extended family. An article in Bloomberg Businessweek about changing patterns in the American diet also demonstrates how moral revolutions can take place so quickly. As the authors explained, cultural shifts don't happen overnight. They build slowly. A sip of coconut water here, a quinoa purchase there. And suddenly, the American diet looks drastically different than it did 10 years ago. Indeed, most of us can recognize this just by looking at our own dinner tables. But now imagine that same process expanded into the realm of morality and the major issues of life. In truth, the same kind of process has taken place. Just as changes in the diet take place without often being perceived, the same is true of the vast shift in morality that is taking place all around us, and we cannot say we are not warned. Writing back in 1956, Peter M. Sorokin sounded an alarm about what he called the American sex revolution. Sorokin, the first professor of sociology and later head of that department at Harvard University, was a moral prophet. As a member of the intellectual elite at Harvard, Sorokin represented the mainstream moral understanding of America at the time, and he was profoundly alarmed at the sexual revolution he saw taking place all around him. Among the many changes of the last few decades, a peculiar revolution has been taking place in the lives of millions of American men and women. Quite different from the better-known political and economic revolutions, it goes almost unnoticed. Devoid of noisy public explosions, its stormy scenes are confined to the privacy of the bedroom and involve only individuals. Unmarked by dramatic events on a large scale, it is free from civil war, class struggle, and bloodshed. It has no revolutionary army to fight its enemies. It does not try to overthrow governments. It has no great leader. No hero plans it, and no Politburo directs it. Without plan or organization, it is carried on by millions of individuals, each acting on his own. As a revolution, it has not been featured on the front pages of our press or on radio or television. Its name is the sex revolution. There is a particular power to Sorokin's use of the word revolution. In a way most of us cannot even conceive, Sorokin knew how revolutions happened and the carnage they often left in their wake. Born in Russia, Sorokin was condemned to death by the last emperor, Tsar Nicholas II. Escaping that death sentence, he later served as private secretary to the interim government that was in place after the death of the Tsar. Sentenced to death once again, he was eventually exiled by Vladimir Lenin, an event that prompted his move to the United States and eventually to Harvard University. In other words, Sorokin used the word revolution to make a point that no other word would convey. Even in 1956, he saw the world being turned upside down. He saw the sexual revolution coming in full force. The idea of a sexual revolution can be traced back to the 19th century, when intellectuals in Europe began to push back against the inherited sexual morality that had come into Western civilization through the Christian tradition. Fueled with a desire to redefine love and sex for a new age, these intellectuals argued that Christian sexual morality was inherently repressive, and that true liberty could only come to human beings if the sexual morality derived from the Bible was overthrown and subverted. For the most part, calls for a sexual revolution in the 19th century were primarily confined to a class of self-consciously liberal intellectuals who lived mostly on the fringes of the establishment cultures in Europe and the United States. All that began to shift in the 20th century, as vast changes in Western societies occurred with the cataclysms of two world wars, the new industrial age, and the rise of a general spirit of revolution. In a fairly short span of time, many of the ideas that had been limited to an intellectual fringe were discussed in more mainstream sectors of society. The academic world also began to pay serious attention to these transformations, driven by a significant turn toward individual autonomy and the idea that many of the problems faced by modern human beings were actually caused by the repressive presence of the Christian moral tradition. In the United States, the 20th century began with laws in place in virtually every community that criminalized forms of sexual behavior considered aberrant. These communities also recognized marriage between a man and a woman as the only proper context for sexual behavior, procreation, and the raising of children. Fast forward to the end of the 20th century, and pornography is so pervasive that it is just a click away from the nearest computer screen. The legal definition of obscenity is now almost impossible to violate, and the local newsstand offers sexually explicit material in the form of mainstream entertainment. Legal codes have been redefined so that the only operational issue in the criminalization of sexual behavior is the element of consent. In the main, the decriminalization of what had been considered aberrant sexual behaviors was virtually complete by the first years of the 21st century. Another interesting development in all this is that the sexual revolution was so utterly successful that most Americans living today do not even recognize that it happened. Yet a comparison of American culture in 1950 with today reveals that the sexual revolution has reached almost every corner of the culture and every dimension of life. As Lillian B. Rubin observed in her book Erotic Wars, what happened to the sexual revolution? In the public arena, sex screams at us from every turn. From our television and movie screens, from the billboards on our roadways, from the pages of our magazines, from the advertisements for goods, whether they seek to sell automobiles, soap, or undergarments. Bookstore shelves bulged with volumes about sex, all of them dedicated to telling us what to do and how to do it. TV talk shows feature solemn discussions of pornography, impotence, premarital sex, marital sex, extramarital sex, group sex, swinging, sadomasochism, and as many of the other variations of sexual behavior their producers can think of, whether the ordinary or bizarre. Even the comic strips offer graphic presentations of every aspect of adult sexuality. What drives the sexual revolution? The 20th century will be recognized as the century of the greatest change in sexual morality in the history of Western civilization. But even as our own century is plowing new ground of moral revolution, the fact remains that the seeds were planted in the 20th century. The question remains, how did all this happen? We have already seen that the sexual revolution did not emerge in a vacuum. Modern societies created a context for moral revolution that had never been available before. Certain cultural conditions had to prevail in order for the revolution to get the traction it needed to succeed. One of these factors was the rise of urbanization. As odd as it may seem, even as the city is a concentration of human beings, it actually offers an unprecedented opportunity for anonymity. Many observers of the sexual revolution point to the fact that, from the very beginning, the sexual revolution was a cosmopolitan revolution, emerging first in cities and then spreading out to the rest of the culture. Similarly, technological advances fueled the sexual revolution. Contraceptive technology, in particular, has spurred the velocity of the sexual revolution. Put bluntly, so long as sex between a man and a woman implied the possibility of pregnancy, there was a biological check on extramarital sexual activity. Once the pill arrived, with all its promises of reproductive control, the biological check on sexual immorality that had shaped human existence from Adam and Eve forward was removed almost instantaneously. Closely related to these advances in contraceptive technology was the arrival of sex experts. The so-called researcher Alfred Kinsey, or the Masters and Johnson team, gave the sexual revolution the air of scientific authority. Kinsey's research, for example, was touted by the intellectual elites in America as proof that Americans were actually living by a moral code that was already diametrically opposed to what Christianity thought. But Kinsey's research was fraudulent from the start, an outright deception, according to author Sue Browder. Nevertheless, as Browder noted, in the last 50 years, Kinseyism has been used to sway court decisions, pass legislation, introduce sex education into our schools, and even push for a redefinition of marriage. The revolution also required massive alterations in the law. A legal revolution was needed to revise laws that restricted sexual behavior and criminalized certain conduct. The same revolution in the law would eventually redefine marriage itself in order to remove it as the central expectation and boundary for all legitimate sexual relationships. By the middle of the 1970s, most of the legal groundwork for the sexual revolution had been accomplished in the United States. Virtually all that remained was the normalization of homosexuality. The Supreme Court struck down all criminal laws prohibiting consensual same-sex behavior in the 2003 case Lawrence v. Texas. Then, in 2013, it struck down the federal government's definition of marriage as exclusively the union of a man and a woman in United States v. Windsor. Thus, by the year 2013, very little remained of the correspondence between American law and the moral convictions that had shaped the society just a century before. This revolution in the law was preceded by a revolution in American academic thought that fueled the future decisions handed down by the courts. During the 1930s and 40s, even before the advent of the Kinsey reports, professors and leading intellectuals in America began to speak of the inherited sexual morality as repressive, echoing fringe voices recognized as dangerously radical just a half-century before. Oddly enough, even as the United States entered a period of tremendous family stability in the aftermath of the Second World War, the intellectual foundations were so shaken that, by the end of the 1950s, leading academics were speaking of the natural family and living in the suburbs as the example of what Americans should recognize as an artificial existence, shaped by a repressive sexual morality and false cultural expectations. By the 1990s, the most respected mainstream academic institutions in America featured academic departments that were devoted entirely to the study and promotion of the strangest and most exotic theories of human sexuality, and often their practice as well. Many of these academics and intellectuals argued that all morality was merely socially constructed and was generally put in place by repressive authorities in order to preserve their power. Thus, the impulse toward liberation that was recognized as driving the dynamic toward democracy in much of the world was extended to morality, with the explicit argument that those who were identified as sexual minorities must be liberated as part of the project of democracy and liberty. And of course, these new ideologies ultimately trickled down into high schools and even into grade schools. By the time the average American child graduates from a public school in the United States, he has been bombarded with the propaganda of the moral revolutionaries. In many school systems and districts, parents do not even have an opt-out provision to remove their children from these sex education programs. Of course, none of this would have been possible if Christianity had maintained a vital voice and the ability to speak prophetically to the larger culture concerning matters of marriage, sex, and morality. Nevertheless, the process of secularization had so shaped Western societies by the end of the 20th century, and the United States in particular, that the moral authority of the Christian Church was largely neutralized, certainly among the cultural and intellectual elites. Even as the vast majority of Americans would continue to identify as Christians in some way, It was clear that the restraining power of biblical morality no longer had the respect of the larger society and of those who had the greatest influence in the elite sectors of the nation. By the second decade of the 21st century, the Pew Research Center would report that fully 20% of Americans list none as their religious identification, and this increased to 30% among younger Americans. Furthermore, younger Americans, those most intensely shaped by the moral revolution, would indicate a growing distancing from Christianity and its morality, and a greater acceptance of the norms of the sexual revolution. The Sexual Revolution and the Death of Morality. The postmodern quest for sexual emancipation cannot be neutral when it comes to the teachings of the Bible and the moral witness of historic Christianity. The inevitable collision between the two becomes very clear when we listen to the sexual revolutionaries. For example, John Heidenreich, who traces what he calls the rise and fall of the sexual revolution, looks to the future and argues, "The road to sexual emancipation, though long and difficult, is not endless. Someday we will find the courage to declare that freedom of sexual expression does not mean merely a license to cast off sexual inhibitions. Rather, it means the freedom to love another person on a consensual adult basis, without fear of penalty or recrimination. Such freedom implies that sex is morally neutral, a position increasingly being adopted by enlightened elements within the Christian and Judaic traditions. Finally, universal freedom of sexual expression means that no one sexual group has any claim to the moral high ground, nor has it any basis regulating the consensual adult sexual behavior of any other group." The most important aspect of Heidenreich's argument is the fact that he believes the sexual revolution cannot be complete until there is no moral high ground held by any form of sexual morality so long as adults are involved, and they consent to the activity. In his view, any morality that goes beyond that is false and oppressive. Also note the fact that he points to what he identified as enlightened elements within the Christian and Judaic traditions, as helping to fuel his revolution. Of course, those enlightened elements are the elements that are seeking to hollow out the central teachings and core of Christianity and Judaism, leaving nothing but the sexual revolution and moral relativism to remain. And that takes us back to where we began. Theo Hobson's observation that the moral revolution we now face presents the Christian church with what he sees as a nearly insurmountable challenge, because the current situation in the culture appears to call for the virtual abandonment of everything Christians have known from the Bible and everything the Christian church has taught for 2,000 years. Understanding the challenge before us is a necessary first step. But the Christian church is called not only to understand the challenge, but to respond to it in faithfulness. As Flannery O'Connor rightly warned, our responsibility is to push as hard as the age that pushes against you. That's going to require a monumental act of faithfulness for the Christian church in this generation. But as we must clearly understand, anything less will mean the abandonment of Christianity. 2. It didn't start with same-sex marriage. Opposition to the Christian understanding of sex and marriage did not begin with the arrival of same-sex marriage. Long before those in same-sex relationships had any realistic hope for the legal recognition of their unions, heterosexuals in the modern age seemed to be accomplishing the weakening and structural compromise of marriage all on their own. To understand this, we have to first take a look at some of the major intellectual and cultural shifts that led to the collapse of Christian morality among heterosexuals. Any consideration of the eclipse of marriage in the last century must take into account four massive developments: birth control and contraception, divorce, advanced reproductive technologies, and cohabitation. All four of these together are required to facilitate the sexual revolution as we know it today. The redefinition of marriage could not have happened without these four developments. Birth control and contraception. The arrival of modern contraception changed human history, and the sexual revolution was fueled by the separation of sex from procreation. A number of evangelicals simply consider birth control and contraceptive technology to be features of the modern age that can be used without much moral or biblical reflection. This was not always the case. In fact, the use of birth control was condemned by every single Christian denomination at the beginning of the 20th century. If that statement shocks you, just consider the scale of the moral revolution that is reflected in your surprise. Historically, the Christian Church condemned birth control because it has always sought to uphold the worth and dignity of children. Christians have consistently understood that children are, in every circumstance, a divine gift. This affirmation was so central to Christianity throughout the centuries that the issues of birth control, abortion, and infanticide were largely considered to be one and the same. The Christian Church has always been concerned to promote the notion that children are to be welcomed, and that any failure to welcome a child is itself an act of unfaithfulness. The first church to break with the Christian tradition by affirming birth control and contraception was the Church of England. The 1930 Lambeth Conference, the periodic gathering of the bishops of the Church of England, and the Anglican Communion, provided the context for the emergence of arguments for the acceptance of birth control. These arguments grew out of the Church's desire to respond to the unique challenges posed by the modern age, the teeming population of British cities, and the demand of couples for increasing control over their reproductive destinies. Concerns about overpopulation, largely driven by the theories of Thomas Malthus, led many to fear that the world would die of starvation due to increasing population. These fears that continue to be driven by a moral regime that is actively antinatalist, committed to lowering the birth rate. This flies in the face of the fact that the real demographic challenge of our times is an aging population with too few births rather than too many. Early social observers also pointed to poverty in great cities such as London, and suggested that birth control was necessary in order to limit the spread of social pathologies. In the United States, similar arguments were made by figures such as Margaret Sanger, who founded the organization eventually known as Planned Parenthood. But Sanger, along with so many of the other early activists for birth control, was driven by the theory of eugenics, an openly racist worldview and movement that operated by the motto, "More from the fit, less from the unfit." The inherent racism behind the population control movement and abortion is now a horrible embarrassment to the birth control movement. Nevertheless, it was one of the arguments that offered political momentum and assistance to the demand that birth control be normalized and legalized. In the United States, most Protestant denominations resisted the temptation to endorse birth control and contraception, though several of the more liberal denominations had begun to accommodate the birth control mentality by the mid-20th century. Evangelicals, for the most part, simply ignored the issue. The energies of evangelical Christians had been devoted to so many other moral issues that birth control largely escaped focused attention. This set the stage for conservative Christians to be essentially co-opted by the contraceptive revolution when it took place, driven by the development and availability of the pill in the early 1960s. It is shocking now to look back and see how little conversation took place among evangelicals at that time. One major development in the Christian conversation took place when Pope Paul VI released his encyclical Humanae Vitae in 1968. The Pope surprised and disappointed many Catholics who believed that the Catholic Church would answer the contraception question with at least a modified allowance of artificial birth control. Instead, the Pope definitively closed the door on any artificial birth control, declaring that Catholic couples must be open to the gift of children in each and every occasion of sexual intercourse. The Catholic Church based its moral reasoning upon the classical Christian tradition and the Catholic appropriation of natural law. Evangelicals, forced at least in part by questions raised by the new definition of the Catholic position, seemed to be largely thankful that they had no pope to make such a declaration. Most evangelicals seem to think that birth control was a Roman Catholic preoccupation, and that evangelicals should not understand contraception to come with any urgent theological or moral questions. And yet it was evangelicals, not Roman Catholics, who were stepping outside of the Christian mainstream when it came to approving artificial birth control. Ultimately, the availability of birth control in a reliable form, particularly in the form of the pill, unleashed the sexual revolution. So long as sex was predictably related to the potential of pregnancy, a huge biological check on sex outside of marriage functioned as a barrier to sexual immorality. Once that barrier was removed, sex and children became effectively separated, as sex became redefined as an activity that did not have any necessary relation to the gift of children. It is impossible to exaggerate the importance of the separation of sex and babies from the moral equation. Birth control also became the occasion for more radical changes that enabled and fueled the sexual revolution. When restrictions on access to birth control were challenged in the legal sphere, yet another avenue was opened to advance the sexual revolution. Most importantly, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965, declared that married Americans had a right to access to birth control under the right to privacy, claimed to be assured by the Constitution. In his famous opinion, Justice William O. Douglas acknowledged that no such right was to be found in any explicit form within the text of the Constitution, but he claimed to have found the right to privacy, including the right to access to birth control in what he defined as penumbras, that were formed by emanations from those guarantees that help give them life and substance. That strange legal language became the recipe that drove the sexual revolution forward at warp speed. Justice Douglas found a right to privacy in the sexual sphere that no previous generation believed was on the minds of the framers of the Constitution in any sense. He acknowledged, quite straightforwardly, that the right he had found within the Constitution was not found in its actual words. That is why he had to speak of penumbras and emanations coming from the Constitution. To understand just how this fueled the sexual revolution, consider how that same kind of legal reasoning led to the court's finding of a woman's right to an abortion, or of a same-sex couple's right to marry. This huge shift in American law had precursors, to be sure, but we can look back to contraception as the key issue in the Griswold case, in order to understand how the courts became the major engines of sexual revolution. The moral revolution on the issue of contraception was fueled further just 7 years later, when in 1972 the Supreme Court handed down the case of Eisenstadt v. Baird. This decision overturned a Massachusetts law that prohibited the prescription and distribution of birth control to unmarried couples. Clearly, the Supreme Court had now marginalized marriage, and the marital union was no longer the template for the moral context of legitimate sexual activity in the United States. So add the development of birth control to the legal energies of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the recipe for a moral revolution was nearly complete. In more recent years, many evangelicals have begun to reconsider the morality of birth control and contraception and, on the positive side, have come to affirm the unconditional goodness of the gift of children. Even when evangelicals do not accept the Catholic admonition that each and every act of marital sex must be equally open to the gift of children, at the very least, evangelicals must affirm that every marriage must be open to the gift of children, and that, should pregnancy occur, it is to be seen as an unconditional gift rather than as an imposition. However, the lack of serious evangelical engagement with the arrival of birth control set the stage for evangelical failure on an even larger level, and that failure is tied to the issue of divorce. Divorce. Like birth control, divorce was inconceivable for most Christians throughout the history of the Christian Church. Where it was legally available, it was under the most restrictive conditions in which some guilt, usually adultery, had to be assigned to one party or the other that would, on credible legal grounds, justify a divorce. Thus, without any apology, courts rooted in the Western tradition treated marriage with such respect that the dissolution of marriage required a legal process that was complicated and often excruciating. But these difficult legal processes were not without purpose. They were intended to make a point about the value of marriage and the disaster that every marital breakup represents. Indeed, as the writer Pat Conroy once stated, every divorce is the death of a small civilization. The Christian Church, joined by the secular state, had for centuries affirmed the larger civilization's responsibility to protect every one of those smaller civilizations. As the 20th century dawned, however, theories of sexual liberation and developments in the law began to point toward a potential loosening of the restrictions on legal divorce. During the same period, many people, aided and abetted by the legal system, basically adopted a form of hypocrisy, admitting and imputing certain fault on legal grounds in order to obtain a divorce. At the same time, when the trauma of divorce produced a trial, it was, as the critics of existing divorce law often asserted, a truly grueling process filled with human misery. During the 1960s, work to make divorce more readily available and to remove the stigma and pain of the judicial process led to the development of what became known as no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce was sold to the populace as a humanizing effort to allow marriages that were declared irretrievably broken to be terminated without the necessity of a court trial, painful testimony, and some finding of guilt. The first major no-fault divorce law was signed into effect by then-Governor Ronald Reagan in California in 1969. Reagan, who had been divorced, saw traditional divorce as inhumane, and thus saw no-fault divorce as a more humane means of dealing with marital strife. Nevertheless, it soon became clear that the advent of no-fault divorce meant that the contraceptive revolution was followed by yet another revolutionary wave. The consequences for marriage were catastrophic. No-fault divorce, soon available in one form or another in virtually every state, became the norm in the United States by the end of the 20th century. The divorce rate skyrocketed, leading to pathologies that the humane endorsers of no-fault divorce had either not foreseen or not adequately considered. For example, the arrival of no-fault divorce, easily obtainable and in many cases uncontestable by a spouse, led not only to the breakup of families, but also to a pandemic of abandoned children. The devastating effects on children, and on boys in particular, caused by absentee fathers, is now well known and well documented. Furthermore, in almost every case, fathers generally found themselves in stronger economic positions 5 years after the divorce. In contrast, the wife and children left behind in the wake of no-fault divorce were most often left economically disadvantaged. Ultimately, no-fault divorce became, whether acknowledged or not, a way of making every single marriage provisional. Marriage was thus shifted from being a covenant into being a mere contract and, as many of the proponents of easy divorce made clear, a contract just like any other, that should be considered in force only insofar and for so long as both parties feel equally committed to the contract. But as an analysis of marriage throughout history makes clear, marriage has never worked solely as a contract. It only endures and serves its purposes within human society if it is understood as a covenant that requires the commitment not only of the man and the woman who enter it, but of the entire civilization to respect and protect it from invasion, from subversion, and from being undermined by forces either from within or without. Regrettably, If the society failed with the challenge of divorce, the Christian church failed even more inexcusably. The secular world may have looked at the Western legal tradition as something that could be amended or changed according to modern moral standards and popular demand. But Christians, supposedly bound to Scripture and the enduring truths of Christianity, should have understood that the divorce revolution flew directly in the face of clear biblical teachings. No-fault divorce is a rejection of the scriptural meaning of covenant that stands at the very heart of the Christian gospel. Nevertheless, Christian churches generally surrendered to the divorce rate revolution and abdicated their moral and biblical responsibility to uphold marriage in its covenantal essence. Many factors were behind this failure. On the one hand, increasing numbers of Christian churches and denominations, surrendering to the larger ethic of personal autonomy, abdicated the responsibility of church discipline. In the same way that so many secular authorities had argued for no-fault divorce as a way of overcoming the hypocrisy of the older system of divorce law, many Christians began to advocate the abandonment of biblical church discipline because of the hypocrisy that sometimes corrupted that process.